How often do you think back to growing up? For me, I think back to a lot of things a lot of times. You know, I like to reminisce, for one thing, and think about things. I was actually telling my Sunday school class a story that didn't really involve me, but involved my brother, and just thinking about that and the difference in the times then and the times now. It's just kind of amazing, just in my lifespan, how much the world has changed. And some of you look back on your childhood and growing up in different ways. You know, for some of you it was pretty smooth sailing growing up. You know, kind of had everything you needed and everything you wanted, and maybe even got spoiled a little bit. And then there were some of us that really just had difficulty in childhood and difficulty growing up, and different family dynamics that were involved, and different things that went on. And everybody knows that I am part of a large family. I'm the youngest of 5 children, and being the youngest was sometimes the greatest, and sometimes it was also the worst. You know, I tell people that I got spoiled to death. You know, I got stuff all the time, and they took great care of me. But I also tell people that until I was 18, I thought I was a football tackling dummy a lot of times too. You know, because I got my tail whipped a few times, and not by my parents. You know, and so there's a lot of dichotomy in the differences in the way that we look at things, but we think about what our childhood meant growing up, and what we're to grow up into. You know, if it's easy to watch someone else go through things, but it's much harder when we think about our own experience. You know, sometimes being the youngest brother was not nearly as hard as being the younger brother of my older brother. And I want to explain a little bit about what I'm talking about. My oldest brother, George, is also in ministry. And he actually is 13 years older than me. He was going to Bible college when I was still just getting into elementary school. And so he was a pivotal part of my faith and my faith education growing up. I remember, you know, he was in Bible college when I decided at 8 years old that I wanted to become a Christian and be baptized. And at the time, we were going to the Fairburn Christian Church, which was right up the road from our house, and George was volunteering there while he was in school, and so he took it upon himself. It was one Sunday afternoon. We were going to Sunday night church, and my family was getting ready, and George just said, "I'm going to take Brad with me," and Mom said, "Okay." And then we got out, and I started to get in the car, and he goes, "No, we're not going. We're going to walk." And I was like, "Why?" You know, and so we walked to church, and the whole way we walked to church, he grilled me about my faith and about what being baptized was all about, and if I understood that thing. And I say he grilled me because it was one question right after another. He didn't really mean it like an Inquisition type thing, but that's kind of what it felt like. But he also said that he was impressed that I was, to the degree that I was able to answer some of his questions, and so very graciously he gave my parents the okay for me to be baptized when they got to church that evening. But that's just the way he is. He's a very intense human being, and I'm not always nearly as intense as he is. If any of you have ever met him, you know he walks into the room and the temperature goes up 20 degrees. And he's everywhere. He's doing things. You know, I told the story a couple weeks ago about when I interned with him and I wanted lunch, and we stopped at Bubba's Pump and Save, and he threw a pack of crackers at me and said, "Let's go." You know, and that's just kind of the way it was. And so being his younger brother and also being in ministry like he is, I find myself being compared to him a lot in my life, which can sometimes be very flattering and helps me, but sometimes it can be very intimidating to me. My brother has been very successful in ministry. He went to seminary, and out of seminary he was called down to a church in South Georgia. He went there. The first Sunday that he was there, they had 74 people. Within 5 years, they were running over 300. They were running close to 500 when God led him to somewhere else, which was Peachtree City, which he's there now. And when he went to Peachtree City, it was a church that a lot of people knew about, but was not doing very well. They were running less than 100, and he came on staff, and within 10 years they were running almost 1,000. And so I find myself being compared to him a lot, and people will come up to me and they'll say, "Oh, you're George's little brother," in a lot of ministry circles that I know, and I'll go, "Yeah, I'm George's little brother," which it's never bothered me for people to call me George's little brother, because that's what I am, and I'm proud to be his little brother, and I'm proud for anybody to call me little at this point in my life, to be honest with you. But people will go, you know, so you're in ministry too. Yeah, well, you're in ministry, and well, you know, well, tell me about your ministry, and I'll tell them about my ministry, and you know, I've actually had people say to me, "Well, your ministry has not been as successful as George's ministry," and I said, "Well, that's all up to you, I guess." Luckily, my brother has never treated me that way, and he's always been gracious to me and been an incredible mentor to me, and I'm so very proud of him and glad to have him as a leader and as a guide in my life. And it's been so very exciting for me these last few years to be able to actually work with him and work on sermon preparation together. And it's really almost like a dream come true for me to be able to be as connected with him as I am. It's wonderful. But it can be hard too. It can be hard to be called George's little brother. It can be hard to say, well, you know, you haven't achieved all the things that he's achieved and done all the things that he's done. My brother's also very connected with a lot of people, and he's been the guest chaplain in the U.S. House and Senate several times. I've sat and watched my brother on C-SPAN pray before Congress, and you go into his office, and all these people that you know, he's got all these pictures up on his office wall with that people have signed. And the last time I was with him, he was like, he said something about country music, and I said, I don't really care for country music. He goes, well, you don't like Zac Brown? And I'm like, I'm not a huge Zac Brown fan. He goes, well, I'm going to tell him. And I said, what do you mean? And he has Zac Brown's phone number in his iPhone, and he texted Zac Brown and told him, my little brother doesn't like you very much. I'm like, thanks a lot for that. He actually helped Zac wanted to start a camp for children down in the Atlanta area, and was running into some political issues with that, and George helped him, and so they've become good friends. We were even talking about the Passion of the Christ movie recently, And George told me, he goes, well, I told him, I said, well, I heard that Jim Caviezel, the man who played Jesus in The Passion of the Christ, said that actually taking that role actually hurt him for a while in Hollywood, that people kind of didn't want to touch him, that because of all the backlash to that, and didn't want to cast him in such a way that they would get hurt. And he goes, yeah. When I talked to Jim about that, he was telling me about that. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. So here's all these things that he has and knows and is and does. And so sometimes it can be tough to be George's little brother. But I've learned a lot from my big brother. I've learned a lot, and I love him. And I know that he loves me, and it makes me feel good when he tells me how proud of me he is. He really is more like, I tell people I didn't really grow up with 3 brothers and a sister. I pretty much grew up with 4 dads and 2 moms. But being George's little brother can sometimes be tough, but can you imagine being Jesus' little brother? James is Jesus' little brother. He spent his childhood growing up with Jesus and knows probably more about him than anybody else. Jesus begins his earthly ministry, and it's kind of tough for his brothers to swallow, We know the instance where, mom and the brothers come and tell him to come home, and Jesus says, who's my father and who's my mother and who are my brothers, It's probably been a strained relationship at times. It's probably been a difficult relationship at times. But it's nonetheless, they are brothers. And they come to this place. They come to this place in life where James comes to the full understanding of who Jesus is and becomes one of his greatest spokespeople in the world, to the point that he writes the book of James, which is one of my favorite books in the New Testament. He's writing to every Christian in every nation. This letter that he writes is for everybody, and it's for everyone, not just for those who would read it who are his contemporaries, but for us even today. I tell people that the book of James is maybe the most practical application book of the New Testament. He's just very plain. I love that about James. He just kind of tells it like it is. And then he says, to start out the book, consider it pure joy when you go through trials. He starts in the very beginning saying something that's kind of difficult to understand for people. Consider it pure joy when you go through trials. James knows a little bit about growing up in hard times. He knows a little bit about having difficulty in life. He knows a little bit about dealing with the popularity of his older brother and not really people paying a whole lot of attention to him, most likely. He knows a lot about the difficulty of watching his older brother strike out on this path that even he doesn't fully understand. That he thinks at times may be causing embarrassment to his family, and he's not really sure where he's going with this. And so James understands dealing with difficulty. I can imagine all the people that through through when Jesus started his earthly ministry that would come to James and go, hey, isn't that your big brother? What in the world is going on with him? What is he doing? What is he trying to accomplish? Is your family just nuts? Is there something wrong with y'all? And fielding those questions constantly and completely, it's just, I can imagine the pressure that he felt. James knows a little bit about that, but James says, here's the thing. When you go through these trials, when you go through these hardships, consider it joy. Because even in the face of death, James understands the beauty of a relationship with Christ. He understands what God is trying to do here and what's going on. And it's a consistent theme for James that what happens when you go through these difficult trials, it strengthens you. Can you imagine what your life would be like if you lived without any kind of difficulty? I think we have some examples of that in pop culture. Of these kids that grew up with a silver spoon in their mouth, that grew up in the line. We have all these people who are absolutely rich and famous for absolutely nothing other than what family they were born into. And we see that privilege and that notoriety and kind of what it does. Seems like there's never really a happy ending there, is there? Because people that grow up without difficulty, they don't know what to do when suddenly they face difficulty. See, you and I didn't have that privileged life. Now, some of us have lives more privileged than others, but there's not anybody in here who has never not dealt with difficulty. The things that happen in life, the things that we go through, the things that what do we sometimes say these things do? What's the saying you hear a lot with people? It made me who I am. You see, difficulty is unavoidable, and what we do with that difficulty has a lot to say with who we are to become. James realizes that. And he talks about it here to make us understand some things. There are some undeniable truths here. Whenever you face difficulty, you will be changed. Listen, Jesus faced difficulty from the very beginning of his earthly ministry. As soon as he was set apart for ministry, the first thing that happened is he went out into the wilderness to fast, and Satan came after him. The very first thing that happened was an attack from the enemy. It says Satan comes after him and promises him all these things if he'll just bow down and worship. And Jesus goes through this difficulty with Satan. But what does it say there in chapter 4, verse 13? If you look at it in the King James Version, it says this, that after it was over, Satan left him for a season. He left him for a little bit, but he was going to come back. He wasn't done. He just had let him win for the moment. The difficulty was going to return. In Acts, the apostles reinforce this because they had been found, they say in Acts chapter 5, verse 41, they had been found worthy of suffering. You know, most of the time when we want to think about being worthy of something, we think about being worthy of something spectacular. You know, I'm worthy of this. I'm worthy of being treated this way. I'm worthy of this gift. I'm worthy of this reward. I'm worthy of all these things. But here you have these guys saying, we are so happy that we are counted worthy to suffer for Christ. That he would even allow us to go through the difficulty that we're going through because of him. Because let's be honest, if we decided, hey, I'm not going to live for Christ in my life, there are some things there's some difficulties that we could avoid in life. We could avoid some of the things that we have to go through, some of the ridicule we have to go through, some of the name calling we have to go through, some of the things that we put ourselves out there that if we didn't really have faith in Christ, we would never put ourselves out there to do. You know, we wouldn't do some of the hard stuff. We wouldn't try to feed the hungry. We wouldn't try to take care of those who couldn't take care of themselves. We wouldn't try to do any of that because there's really no reason to put ourselves out there for any other reason. And we have to understand that trials have a purpose. Think about the story of Joseph and what he went through when his brothers, because of hatred towards him for being the baby, the youngest, and the favorite. Do you know how many times I got accused of being the baby and the youngest and the favorite in my family? In fact, I was accused of that until my nephew Stuart was born 13 years ago. And now everybody in my family calls him the golden child. And and everybody else is like, he's the golden child. I'm so happy that Stuart was born because my family got off my back about being the favorite. But to my credit, I have told people all my life that the reason my parents had 5 children is because they kept trying until they got it right. You know, so I've brought a little bit of it on myself, I have to admit. But Joseph, his brothers threw him in a pit, sold him into slavery. And then we know all the things that happened as a result of that he ended up being the one to save his family and his people because of that. And in Genesis chapter 45, basically what he says is, talking to his family, what you intended for evil, God used for the good. What you intended to be something to get rid of me and to destroy me, God was in it the whole time, and he used it for his purpose and for his good. Trials have a purpose. The difficulty that we go through is not just because we are going through difficulty. There is something to be learned through it. There is something to be gained through it. There is something to be understood through it. And the one thing that we can all say that we should be able to take from any trial that we go through is exactly what James says here, and that's the development of perseverance. How many times have you looked at somebody and said, oh, you haven't been through what I've been through? But you know what? Every single one of us can say that to somebody else. Because guess what? Nobody's ever been through what I've been through. Nobody's ever been through what you've been through. We all want to categorize it, though, don't we? You know, like I've been through so much more than anybody else has been through until we start talking to somebody else. I'll never forget my dad told me, he said, son, here's 2 things I want you to understand. There's always somebody better than you, but there's always somebody worse off than you. So don't get on your high horse and don't get on your pity party. We develop perseverance, a patient endurance, a frame of mind, of being able to live through an act of suffering. It's the only way that we can grow up. In fact, it helps to identify what our purpose is and who we are. The Greek word there is teleos, which means fully developed, which means fully realized. You know, parents, we go through different phases, don't we? Sometimes we don't want our kids to grow up. Oh, just stay like this forever. We only want them to stay like this forever when they're sweet and cuddly, though, don't we? When they're screaming at 4 a.m., we want them to grow up, don't we? We want them to be able to take care of themselves. You know? Children want to grow up. That's all they talk about and think about from the time they can realize what they're talking about and thinking about. You know? That's why little kids, you know, like somebody asks me how old I am, and I'm like, I'm in my 40s. You know? You ask a little kid how old they are, I am 4 7/8. You know? I will be 5 1/8 of a year. You know, they are serious about that age. They are serious to getting to that next age. And there are certain ages that seem to be rites of passage, you know. 10, double digits. That was a big one, you know. 16, driver's license, which I think it ought to be like 28, but that's a whole nother story, you know. 21, because they're idiots, you know. I remember even when I was in Bible college, looking forward to turning 25. You know why I look forward to turning 25? Because at that time, I could go and rent a stinking van to take kids on a youth trip without somebody else going with me. You know how bad it feels to be a grown man, to have to walk into the rental place with one of your elders, say, hey, he's got to sign for the van for me because I'm only 22, you know. And so I was looking forward to turning 25. I also knew at 25 my insurance premiums dropped. You know, that 25 was about the time when I started realizing, hey, I am an adult, you know, because I'm looking forward to my insurance premiums dropping. That's when you start realizing maybe I'm finally getting to adulthood. We are designed to grow up, though. You know, as much as I don't like it sometimes, you know, every day I look at Sydney and I'm like, ugh. Wayne was talking about social media, and one of the pure evils of social media to me is this thing on Facebook called Time Hop. Any of you know what I'm talking about? Like you'll open up your Facebook that morning and it'll show you this picture from years ago and it says, don't you want to post it? And I posted one this morning because it just tore me up. But my Time Hop picture was a picture of Sydney from like 5 years ago at Jandy's frozen yogurt with her little pigtails and her little fat face and, you know, and just cute as she could be. And now she's this tall and speaking in complete sentences and all this kind of stuff. It's crazy. I remember one day sitting in the car and realizing that it was just me and Sydney in the car and that we were having a conversation. It was kind of a surreal moment for me. Like, this isn't just this little baby that I'm raising. Like, this, she's turning into a person. And I'm not really excited about that. But we are designed to grow up. We're designed to grow up. You know, unless there's some kind of physical problem, we do grow up. And we get bigger and we get taller and our brains develop and we get smarter and different things happen and different things go on. And all these things take us, but listen, we're designed to grow up spiritually too. We are designed to grow up spiritually. Growing up requires perseverance. That's why James leads with this. Growing up requires perseverance. So what does it take to have perseverance? I want to share with you just a few things that it takes to have perseverance. First of all, it takes the right attitude. I talked about my brother being in South Georgia. When he was in South Georgia, he was the chaplain for the Effingham County football team. And these guys, they were amazing. I mean, there's just no other way about it. I remember because I was in high school at this time. I'm actually the same age. I think I'm actually maybe a year older than this kid I'm about to talk about. But I remember George. I would go down to see him, and if it was during a football game, he was on the sidelines with the football team, so I got to go down on the sidelines with him. I'm the same age as these kids, and I was intimidated by them. What would have been my senior year, which would have been this kid's junior year, the offensive line for the Effingham County football team, height and weight average, was bigger than any college in the state of Georgia and bigger than about 5 or 6 NFL teams. These kids were enormous. Big, just old country-fed, country-strong boys. You know, it wasn't because of the weight program. It was because of Grandma's cornbread that a lot of them were as big as they were. But they were huge, and they were tough. And in 1987, they went to the state championship. And it was just incredible. But there was this kid that played, and George said he was the most phenomenal football player he's ever seen in his life, bar none. And we've seen a lot of football players in our lives. Saw Herschel Walker play as a high school player. And he said this kid, in his mind, was better. He was just a man among boys. But he wasn't a great student, so he had to work, and he ended up going to Georgia Southern instead of going to one of the big D1 schools because of some academic issues. But George was actually friends with the coach at Georgia Southern at the time, who is now the head coach at Georgia Tech, Paul Johnson. And Coach Johnson called George and said, "I need you to come talk to this kid." He goes, he's not going to last. So George went to talk to him, and he's just full of ego and full of, "I'm too good for this," and blah, 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 blah. And George tried to talk to him and tried to reason with him and tried to help him to understand, and he just wouldn't do it. And so he ended up getting kicked off the football team and kicked out of school. He kind of rambled around for a while, and he ended up at Valdosta State, and he went to Valdosta State, and he ended up having a pretty decent couple years there, and went undrafted in the NFL, but signed a free agent contract. And by the time he got there, he kind of realized what life was kind of like, and George had reconnected with him, and George was trying to help him out. He ended up playing about 10 or 12 years in the NFL. Not as any kind of superhero starter. Most of his time was spent on special teams. He even spent a stint with the Falcons, and ended his career in about 2006 or 7, I think. But he now coaches high school football at one of the bigger schools down in Gwinnett County, and has done really well. But he just didn't have the right attitude. Where he could have been a superstar, where he could have been maybe the number 1 draft pick in the NFL, he chose to do it his way. Got to have the right attitude. We got to realize what is God and what is not God. What is your desire and what is God's desire, and be aware of the consequences. And don't get captured into what everybody else does. I got a picture I want to show you. This is the band from the early 90s, Limp Bizkit. Some of you, if any of you recognize them by their music, you have awful, awful taste in music. There is an urban legend going around, and that it's starting to take on some water, that it might actually be true. That this band was started by executives at MTV who said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a bunch of talentless hacks, put them together, and we're going to market them to the teeth. And guess what? America will catch on. That America will decide, hey, this is a cool band with a cool sound and does cool things, and we're going to listen to them, and we're going to follow them, and we're going to do all this. And they did. They had a really good run there in the early 90s. It didn't last very long. When your song lyrics could be written by a preschooler, that usually happens. But well, never mind. But the fact of the matter is that they were put out there, and they were put out there as, hey, these guys are great. And guess what? People just started saying, hey, these guys are great. Not because they thought they were great, but because everybody else was saying they were great. Because MTV was saying that they were great. Because they were on MTV every 2 minutes. And so it just started this thing. Listen, you can either listen to what the world says, and the world tells you that bands like Limp Bizkit might be good, or you can listen to what God says. The world has it backwards. The world says, here's what you need to do. You need to entrench yourself in the culture that you're in and be part of it, and so everything can go smoothly, and you can just kind of go with the flow and be in there and be what you want to be, or whatever you're supposed to be. But the fact of the matter is that Jesus was very counterculture. Jesus went totally against the flow. He went against the flow of the popular culture. He went against the flow of the religious culture. He went against the flow of all of the culture, because he was teaching something totally opposite of what the world teaches. Be self-honest and humble. Keep moving. You got to keep moving away from some things, and you got to start moving towards other things. The fruit comes when the tree grows. Some of you are wondering, why isn't my spiritual life improving? Because you're not doing anything to allow it to grow. It's got to be watered. It's got to be nurtured. It's got to be fertilized. It's got to be rooted in something. The scripture tells us we'll be known by our fruit. We'll be known by what we produce. We'll be known by what we do. And listen, we can't be sedentary. I had a friend last night posted on Facebook. He said there's more to God, a relationship with God, than going to church. And I countered that, and I said there's also more than going to church than sitting and filling some space in a pew. Because guess what? It's easy to hit a sedentary target. I could pull out a dart gun right now and take out every one of you. It's harder to hit a moving target. do what it is that you're supposed to do. Get up and be who it is that God has called you to be. Receive the truth. Focus on others. Take the focus off yourself and put it on Him. Realize what it is that God has called us to be and called us to do. Persevere. Stick it out. Move forward. And do something great for Him. Let's pray. God, we thank you. We thank you that James, being the little brother of Jesus, learned so much from his brother. From being around him and being with him and listening to him. God, it's time for some of us to grow up. God, some of us are babies spiritually, and it's time for us to be grown-ups. It's time for us to quit being spoon-fed and to have somebody there always to wipe our mouths and pat our backs and tell us how great we are just for being here. God, it's time for us to quit feeling sorry for ourselves when we go through difficulty in life, but God, to realize that difficulty in life sets us up to be closer to you because we can rely more fully on you. We can learn how to make it through. God, so that one day we could be with you forever in heaven. Let that be our goal. And let it be our goal to take as many people with us as we possibly can. Help us to do what it is that we've been called to do. But God, help us to realize it starts with us. And we need to let it move out from here. We ask and we pray this in Jesus' name.